think I've seen it a little bit in some of my friends that have gone to Christian colleges where they don't, they've been raised in Christian homes, but they get to college and now that they're on their own, they just kind of party and do whatever they want, and they'll still go to chapel, but it's not like it's a real thing for them. And then I have other friends who just kind of have found the church to be a little bit hypocritical because they feel like the church should be doing more for people in need and not just talking about it.
So for some, Christianity hasn't been really central in their life, while for others, they feel like the church isn't making the gospel central enough. Is that kind of a good description?
Yes.
I think one of the key points that we have to always remember is in order for people to have interest in the church continuously has to have interest in them. And I think for young adults, that's very, I know when we go to children's church or VBS, all the people in the church are very interested in us and what we're doing and what we're learning, but I feel like that has to be a continuum that goes all the way through, and when they're young adults in college, for them to continuously want to come back, to know that people care for them at church.
Well, you mentioned American Grace. I know that Pew Forum on Religion Society also did research in a very similar way with the famous line, none of the above. And that's where that's been picked up on so much. And I do think it represents a group of young adults that have sort of been lost in that kind of gap between sort of high school and the heavy investment of the church there, and then their engagement within formal education or beginning to branch out into the world, where they really don't find those anchor points within the life of the church that keeps them connected and wants to hear them, not just do ministry to them, really wants to hear them as contributors within the life of the church. And as a result, there's no really valid reason for them to see how this connects to their lives at that point. And that's a part of the experience I've seen with that. It is interesting, I'll mention one other person, Christian Smith, who knows that sometimes college is not necessarily a negative in that. It really does depend, though, in their perception of the church and the church's investment in them in the long term, I think, has been part of that experience, that, at least as I've encountered young adults who struggle with staying connected to the Christian faith or just staying connected to a religion per se.
Rachel, one of the things that you said that captures my attention is that the disconnect between some of the younger generations in the church isn't necessarily a stylistic kind of a thing. We tend to think, I think in many ways, that if our church would just change this or do this kind of a thing. But what I hear you say is that there's a disconnect that they see in the church itself to say, this isn't actually true to what I see you talking about. So the actions don't match the words necessarily, and so it's not really a style thing at all. It could be, but most of what I'm hearing out of a younger generation is say that if I'm not going to be challenged by the church to engage in a very real way to actually do something, then I don't really have any interest in giving my life to that kind of a church. And so one of the things that I'm seeing a lot in this is that students or young people, if they're 30 and younger, are ready to give their lives to something. I don't see a whole generation of just totally apathetic people. What I see is people who are really ready to engage, but if the church isn't going to be a place of their engagement, they're ready to give their lives other places. Nonprofit organizations, Fortune 500 companies, where their jobs, they're ready to give their life to something. And so the church, I think, in many ways is going to need to struggle with trying to be true to its message, true to its mission, and engage young people into that. I don't know if that's true to your experience as well.
The me generation might not be totally accurate. I don't know if you've heard that. I've heard a lot of people talk about this younger generation as being this very self-centered group of people, but there might really be a large group of young people that would love to be given away for the sake of something larger than themselves. They're just not necessarily always seeing that in the church, and so they're being given away other places. I want to piggyback off of this idea of investment that I heard both Reetu and Dean bring up about the church investing in young people. What would you say to a church who says, man, we invest in young people. We've got children's ministry and young adult and youth group and young adults, and we've got an awesome youth pastor, and we have invested, so how come they're leaving? How come they're not coming back? What would you say to that church who really feels like, man, we've done everything we know to do to make an investment in young people. Why are they not hanging around?
I'll give a stab, but I also want to hear from both Reetu and Rachel on this one. I think part of the problem has been that we've invested in children and youth more, and I'll use a strange word, more like consumers. This is the style question I think that Tim's talking about, that they're sort of recipients of what we give, but we've not invited them into saying, how do you contribute to the life of this church? How do you make a difference? And maybe part of this is that we've tended to put them in silos so that they're not seeing the whole life of the community together and seeing how they fit within that. And so those would be some of the first places I'd start to raise that question. More and more conversations are about what is intergenerational about what we do, and that isn't just how do we as adults sort of provide something for other ages, but how do we invite them into the life of the church so that they're actually contributing to and making a difference in the life of adults as well, and seeing that they have issues that they really want to address and being careful to listen to them instead of trying to provide all the answers sometimes.
I actually completely agree with that. I think one of the things after we pour into them, one of the things we need to do is hand over some leadership to them so that they feel like, you know, it's their opportunity to pour into others. That's something that will bring them back and keep them there. For example, I have a friend in high school who went to college, and then when he came back, he wanted to be in the college ministry group he wanted to start, but the church was so small that they didn't have one. All they had was one adult Bible study every Wednesday night, which was completely fine, but for him, there were other college students that wanted to do stuff together, and so they asked the pastor, can we just start our own college ministry that would just meet on Wednesday nights? And they said no, simply for the fact that they didn't feel like he was equipped enough, or that they didn't have enough people, but for some reason they wouldn't let them, and so he ended up leaving, and I haven't seen him in church since. So.
And that's the rub, isn't it? That when you turn over leadership to someone, you're really entrusting them to do what they're going to do with it, and it may look totally different than what we'd expect. And so when we begin to bump into those generational differences of this isn't the way that I would necessarily see this being done, and yet I still want you, it's almost as if we want young adults on the terms of another generation sometimes, and that we're not necessarily going to turn over real leadership to them. As long as you do it this way, as long as you make it look like this and sound like this, we're okay with that. But real leadership means that we're going to actually turn over quite a bit of the responsibility of leadership to you.
I think another aspect of it is that the church should be a family. And so it shouldn't just be like the youth are over here and the children are over here, and the youth leaders talk to them and connect with them, but the rest of the church just kind of stays in their own bubble. It should be everyone in the church trying to reach out to the young people, and so that they're not just getting leadership or examples to live by their youth leaders, but by people who have lived the Christian life and who are older.
So they're surrounded by that. All of their role models, people they look up to, they see how to live and breathe being Christian. I really want to be sure at the end of this conversation, we're going to come back to the point that Tim just brought up about turning leadership over in a significant way that's not tokenism, that's not saying you fill the perfect little ministry holes that we have, but really allowing the church to be reshaped and reimagined because of the presence of young adults in our midst. But Reetu, it looked like you had another thought you want to share. I don't want to cut you off.
I was just going to say intergenerational Sunday school classes and worship services and just little outings like that are a great way to kind of do that in the church.
Now, there's one thinker who's coined a really helpful term, I think, to kind of wrap some theological perspective around why young adults are looking at the church and saying, this isn't for me. They're not really committing and giving their lives over to the church. And that is moralistic therapeutic deism. And I want Tim to just kind of describe that for us and talk about what moralistic therapeutic deism is. And for those of you who think that sounds like a disease, just kind of understand what it is and how that sort of disease has seeped into a lot of our churches in kind of a underhanded sort of way.
Yeah, Christian Smith, it was a Christian sociologist, was the one who coined the phrase moralistic therapeutic deism. Basically goes to describe the nature of what has been emerging in the church over the last, well, let's say 20 years or so, that young adults are encountering. And really, he's not looking at the church and saying, see, here's what's wrong. He's listening to young adults who are leaving the church, and they are saying, this is the church that we're encountering, and this is why we don't necessarily have any interest in sticking with this church. So moralistic would basically mean that we reduce faith to a set of moralism. So if you're going to be a Christian, that you just do A, B, and C, and that's basically the extent of your Christian faith, and there's that moralistic component that goes along with it. We're not saying that Christianity ought to be immoral, we're just saying that the church has tended to reduce it to just a code of morals. Therapeutic, this is an interesting one. Basically that God is there to make you feel really good, and that you go to the big guy in the sky when you feel really down and low and blue, and that's basically what faith is there to do, is to give you that little boost and to pick you up and dust you off and send you on your way. And the final component, deism, would basically be the theological idea that God is not necessarily involved in the day-to-day activities of our lives, but that God is the divine clockmaker who makes the clock, who winds the clock, and then sets the clock on a table to let it wind itself out, and doesn't really get involved on a daily basis, on a day-to-day scale. And so as Smith is hearing back from young people, people are saying, that's what I'm encountering in the church. Rather than being a community of disciples who desire to follow Jesus, even if it costs me everything, to claim everything about who I am, what young people are tending to encounter is a community formed by moralistic therapeutic deism. People who just want to reduce faith to a code of morals, want to make that feel really good for them, and so you sing the right songs, you do the right things just to kind of get that little jolt. And then there's that deistic component where God's just kind of way off in the distance. And what we're hearing from young people, what the research is showing us, is that is not going to cut it for them. They really are okay with the hard life of discipleship. The discipleship that Dietrich Bonhoeffer would talk about is costly grace, that it's going to cost you everything. But the moralistic, therapeutic, deistic component is what they're encountering in the churches. And so I think for us as church leaders, that's a real wake-up call. How do we make sure that the kind of ministry that we're doing isn't leading us down that particular road? So that's the general definition.
I talk about moralistic therapeutic deism as do good, feel good, God's okay. That's kind of what it's wraps up to be. Do good, feel good, and hopefully you'll make it to a happy place in the sky someday. And it's seeped into a lot of our churches.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that Chris Smith's work's been based on not a global study, but pretty much here in the United States. It's a North American phenomenon, though I think Chris might go so far to say that as much as youth culture has been globalized, you'll see vestiges of this around particularly industrialized countries around the world. I think that's really helpful so that people don't say, well, it doesn't happen anywhere else at all. It is interesting that for him, it really was about good behavior should result in good things happening to me by a God who's fairly benign, doesn't really require anything beyond us. He started that by looking at youth, but he's found that it's been persistent as these youth have become older, as young adults. It doesn't go away. It still is a part of it. It's also important that Chris would say they didn't get this from just anywhere. They didn't get it from the internet. They didn't get it from television. They primarily inherited this from the communities they were part of and from their observing their own parents' sort of implicit view of life, which ought to be a shock, particularly to my generation. Maybe that's one reason I can make this kind of claim, that this is part and parcel, part of the culture of many of them, even conservative evangelical youth that have been in part of churches, alongside a wide continuum of other young adults who've been in the world right now.
And Dean brings up a fascinating point about this being kind of a North American study that's been done. Reetu, your family came here from India, and you've got a really fascinating story. Your family was Sikh, and you came to Christ as a teenager. And when I was listening to your story, which, by the way, Reetu's story is in our book, Seat at the Table, and it's just one of my favorite chapters. I think it's fantastic, your story. But you accepted Christ, and you came home, and I remember you telling me that night you thought, oh no, what have I done? And what I found was fascinating about that was your accepting Christ it wasn't like this kind of sideline part of your life. You immediately recognized that, oh no, nothing is the same. Nothing will ever be the same again. How come you didn't go home and say, oh, well, I guess I don't have to tell anybody about this Christianity thing. It doesn't really have to change anything.
Honestly, it wasn't even an option. Like, as I think back to that night, I realize now, like, I could have just said, no, oh, it's okay, I'll be Sikh again. But at that point, God had just captured my heart so, it was so real that for me, it wasn't even an option to say, oh no, it's okay, my Christianity is nothing. It was just like a little ordeal that happened last night, and I was just so in love and so happy and had so much joy that I knew that was the only thing that I could do, that God had pulled me in so far that I couldn't turn around even if I'd wanted to.
You know, I think what's so tempting about this moralistic therapeutic deism, the do good, feel good, is that every heresy is close to the truth, right? It's not that Christianity wants you to do bad and feel bad, right? And so it's close to the truth, but any goodness that comes from giving our lives to Christ is because God alone is good. And it is good to draw close to the heart of our Creator. So any other experiences that you have about this moralistic therapeutic deism that you see seeping into the church?
In our youth ministry experience, Shawna used a great phrase. She said that parents who are deeply formed by moralistic therapeutic deism are very prone to inoculating their children to church, to discipleship, to deep formation. In other words, they would go through a confirmation process. They would go through some kind of process that was supposed to be a formative process to last them the rest of their life. But for most of them, they were so deeply formed by a theological concept related to moralistic therapeutic deism that it's, well, as long as you get through this, as long as you have a basic knowledge of this, then you don't need to go to church anymore. You don't need to do those kinds of things because God is fairly nice and you're a good person and we're good people and we don't really need to get church all mixed up in our life, and we don't really want to be claimed by anything. And so we would very much sense that parents would be very prone to inoculating their children. You get just enough to where they think, oh, I'm good. I know this Christianity thing. I know this church thing. And it's no surprise then that those are the first students that exit the church. We would hardly see them again because they were not exposed to processes of deep formation. And if that's the church that they were inheriting, I guess my question is, why in the world would they want to give their lives to that? I mean, there are all kinds of other organizations that are doing other things more interesting and engaging and more world-changing than a church that would just kind of say, that's good enough. A little bit is plenty.
I think that makes a lot of sense because in my friendships that I've had, when their parents are sold out for Christ and living lives of discipleship and just giving everything they can to God and the church, my friends who have parents like that are the ones that are now like following Christ and seeking Him wholeheartedly, whereas the ones whose parents just had them go to Sunday school and go to church with them but didn't make it a priority in their own lives are the ones who are not really still in church right now.
They got their Jesus vaccine, and so now they don't need it anymore. Now, I want to move on to the last part of this conversation, which I think is the most hopeful part, and basically saying, all right, the church is not going to look like it always has. As we welcome young adults into our midst, the church is going to be changed by having young adults in our congregations and in our families. Like you just talked about the church being a family. Every new family member changes the chemistry and the makeup of that body of people. So what are the new ways, the new spaces and places where young adults are engaging in the church? What are some of those new things that you're seeing that are allowing young adults to really give their lives to the service of the gospel?
Well, social media is obviously one of the newest ways. For example, if someone is really passionate about Twitter or Facebook, a lot of churches now connect with those, having Facebook pages, having Twitter accounts. So, you know, if someone is really passionate about that kind of stuff in your church, you could have them just be in charge of that, and it would be something they would be continuously doing and feel involved. At the same time, their church would be benefiting from it. So.
I think one of my dreams is to start an exercise ministry, because so many people go to gyms, and a lot of people in our generation are all about getting fit. And I feel like we can use our bodies to stay fit and honor God, and I feel like that would be a way to connect people and bring them in if the church offered some sort of exercise ministry.
That's not your traditional church ministry. You know, you think children's ministry, youth ministry, women's ministry, men's ministry, and we're good. We got church. Church is covered. But this is the new kind of thing that is exciting ways that young adults can engage their congregations. Yeah.
I think a lot of times where you see young adults particularly is not inside the church, but it's engaged as being the church in the midst of community. So what we would typically see as ministries of service and compassion, but also novel ministries that begin as a way of expressing who Christ is in the midst of a local community. And as a result of that, they're quite organic. They look quite different. I mean, it may be starting an exercise ministry, but it may not be in the midst of the gymnasium in the church, but it is a Christian ministry as a result of what's going on. And so I think a lot of the new expressions have really been engaged with that. A couple that I've seen that have been really fascinating to me are using social media even, is trying to take on large issues of justice and naming them in a very Christian way. Human trafficking has been a very important one in and around the Kansas City area, surprisingly, that I've seen a lot of young adults say, we're going to either raise funds that can be used globally to alleviate the problem, or we're going to take our community, which was primarily a young adult church, and we're going to actually invest in the lives of women who've just been released because of a large human trafficking ring that was occurring in Kansas City. But no one thought, how do we go down and be church to these women who've just been released from this? How do we become president? And it was this congregation, primarily of young adults, who said, we need to be the church there. And that was a great expression of a whole new way of doing ministry, but again, not necessarily inside the walls of that congregation, because that congregation being in the midst of the presence of the people that needed that help. I think to me that's where we're going to see a lot of young adult leadership and new ministries that we're going to have to acknowledge as ministry. That to me is important, that we see that and say, yeah, that is a ministry. It doesn't look like the traditional form, but it is a ministry. So those are examples that I've seen.
And that, I think, is going to be the real challenge for the church, is do we create a space for young adults to do that kind of a thing? Theologically, we have to ask ourselves, are we open to what the Spirit might be doing, even if the Spirit is doing something brand new? And are we prepared as a church to have the courage and the openness and the humility to say, we're going to give a lot of space and a lot of expression. We're going to open up lots of seats at the table and allow the presence of young adults and their passions and the ways they're going to connect their faith to issues of justice, to issues of mission, to transform the church. Are we going to allow the church to be transformed as a result of that? Or are we going to maybe succumb a little bit to the temptation to look at that and say, that's not really what we're about here. And so therefore, young adult, you need to probably take that passion. There's lots of other places that can be done. And I think that's going to be the real challenge for us, because we can't necessarily just take young adult life and adopt that into the church and say, well, that you just need to do it on our terms now. As long as you do your ministry like it was done in the previous generations, then you're okay with being the church. The question, I think, facing us, especially with the new expressions of ministry, is, are we going to allow space for that and allow that to actually transform who we are as the church?
Do you feel like God is doing something radically new in the church these days? I love that Tim brought that up, that when the Spirit does something new, we have to be able to welcome whatever that new thing is that the Spirit might do. Do we really feel like this is a time and a space and generation that God is doing something radically new, or is it just that every generation, every year, there's something new, or is there something kind of unique about what's happening in the world around us today that really is this brand new thing?
I feel like I have a lot of friends that are my age, my peers, that are willing to give up so much for Christ. And I know that I don't know a lot of older Christians that are from my own country or anything like that, but I don't really see that in them. And I think that's really cool. And for me, it's just Christ, when he just grabs you like that, you can't do anything but follow him. So
I'll jump in unless you got something to say.
It's hard for me to figure out if it's new or not, because I know there are people, I'm just going off of my dad's experience, who went in and did radical things in an inner city community, and people are still doing that today, and that can be seen as radical then, but it's also still in some ways seen as radical now. And so I don't really know.
As someone who grew up in the baby boomer generation, who assumed everything we did was radical, it's kind of interesting language to hear this now, and you're going, wait a minute, I'm not ready to give up me being the radical one in the room. So I have to be careful how I say this. I think the Spirit of God is always about being afresh and anew as the generations come together. Now let me explain that. I mean, I do think Chris Smith in a different book really talks about how young adults, because in some ways their own socialization, really don't have everything together. And there are gaps, and it's been interesting. There's been a lot of literature right now in being mentors to young adults. And that's been one of the primary models of ministry. Now, here what I'm about to say, the danger is saying, okay, you come and join my ministry, and I will mentor you. That's the tokenism idea that I think is the wrong way of saying it, rather than me saying as an older adult, I don't want to use mature yet, mainly because I'm too crazy to be mature. It's one thing for me to say, let me participate in the ministry that you have, that you envision, that you see, that is a new expression of what God's there, and let me be a part of that and be a mentor, but also learn in that process as well. I think the Spirit of God has constantly been at work doing that in the church, generation to generation, era to era, some in a more poignant way, and I think that is true right now. We've had shifts of how people think, new ways of perspective, new energy with young adults, and I think there's fresh opportunity. The Spirit of God's trying to say, look at what the church can be doing. I do think young adults see that, and they actually need the church to come alongside and to help shape that ministry, but to be shaped as the church at the same time. I hope that makes sense. So it is new, but in some ways it's only reminding, and I think what you said about your dad is important, that it's just a reminder, even the previous generations, of their own newness and how they tried to strike out and present a radical investment in the gospel in their own time, and not just to hang on to that past, but see how that's being replicated in the future as well, and participate in what God's trying to do at that moment. So that's a long answer. It's more, and in some ways, I have to be frank, it's as much for my generation to help us understand how we can contribute, but yet appreciate what God's doing in this new young adult generation these days.
But that requires a lot of humility, and that's where I think it scares me more than anything else, because here we are, relatively on the younger side of life, and yet we've been placed in this position now of senior leadership. We're responsible for shepherding a people. What happens in that church is going to come back to us, and so I want to be sure, after spending years in theological education, preparing well for ministry, that I give my people good, solid teaching, that the theology that's being taught in our church is going to be orthodox, it's going to be really, really good stuff. And so the rub is, I think, for me, to open myself with enough humility to say there are young people in my congregation who need to reshape the way that I envision this ministry unfolding. And so I need to allow that to challenge me in a lot of ways as a lead pastor, that they may be doing things differently and seeing things differently, that I need to open up, because that's the Spirit of God working on my heart. And I just think about all of the new things that the Spirit of God has done in the history of God's salvation. And it's usually those who refuse to see those things that are left on the outside in the history of that salvation. And so I really am challenged by this generation, I think, to be sure that I have the eyes to see and the ears to hear the new thing that God is doing, even if it looks different from the way that I've seen it done throughout my life in the church, and even as a adult on the younger side of life.
You're not that old yet, Tim.
I know I'm not, but that's the, you know what I'm saying?
Hear, so.
But that's, I think, the challenge for us, is that even though I want to do new things and I want to see myself as a radical in some sense, I still feel a responsibility of senior leadership, and so that's the rub.
And I think that's the gift of all generations to each other, and it's really learning to receive from every generation, wherever they are, from the youngest to the oldest. But learn, and I think the key word there is with humility. I mean, grace should invoke humility within our lives. That's the most important thing, that when we realize even the great love of God at work within us. It's interesting how we become so entrenched in our own perspective that sometimes that very humility is the hardest thing to keep reminding ourselves of.
And part of the task of pastors, theologians, and just disciples of Christ is to constantly be discerning and measuring what these new things we're seeing around us up to the gospel, right? Do these line up with the gospel of Jesus Christ? But new things are not something to be afraid of. They're not something to shun. But new things are actually, what I'm hearing you say is new things are indicative of the movement of the Holy Spirit, because the movement of the Holy Spirit is always going to bring with it newness and freshness, and that's a good thing. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm really encouraged about what's going on in the church, especially when I look at people like Reetu and Rachel and what God's doing in your life. Thank you so much, and thanks to NPH and the Church of the Nazarene for letting us have this discussion.